So from when I first gave this talk 5 years ago, I was saying 1 in 7 people on the planet are hungry. It's now, I guess, 1 in 9 are going hungry. Again, not necessarily a reason for celebration, but it is an indication that some progress appears to be made. I think the other important introductory point I wanted to make today was right here in New York at this time, we actually have the climate summit. We have heads of state from all over the world gathered here, discussing what they're going to do about the phenomenon of climate change. We've had a number of meetings here at Columbia and down at the United Nations over the past few days. But the big meeting is today, and it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of that. And many of you would have heard or seen that a very big demonstration, if you like, was held in New York City on the weekend, on Sunday, and around the world, in fact. So there's a lot of interest in climate change, and it's very relevant to the topic that I'm going to be talking about today, of course, because there's a very tight relationship between the global food system and climate change, with agriculture being the major single source of emissions through land use change and through various kinds of agricultural practices. It's also viewed as potentially part of the solution, the possibilities of sequestering carbon through better agricultural practices and systems. But I think what affects most people around the world is the realism that they're probably going to have to adapt to climate change, a 2 degrees at least increase in temperature, and the likelihood of various kinds of catastrophic events, perhaps floods, droughts, high temperatures, all of which will affect the productivity and sustainability of our agricultural system. So I'll come back to those issues a little later, but for now let me move to the first slide. Okay, that's the first slide. Good, so basically what I'm going to try to cover today, I'm going to give a very short overview of the history of agriculture, right? That could be a whole class, a whole semester session, but I'm going to do that in about 3 slides. The current state of food security and nutrition. I'm going to talk about green revolutions. That was in your readings, and hopefully we'll have some interesting questions and discussions on that. And finally, I'm going to talk about what I consider to be really the potential solutions for achieving a sustainable food system, and part of that being sustainable agriculture. And in the process, I have incorporated a number of the comments that came in during the week in advance of this class. I probably haven't included everything, so there's still some space for the questions and comments as the class proceeds. So, to the history of agriculture. Basically, it's pretty much happened over the last 10 to 12,000 years. We entered the Neolithic era. We as humans went from hunting and gathering in various parts of the world at different stages, but essentially transforming the planet. And I think that's the first big message I want to send is we have fundamentally changed the planet through agriculture. About 40% of the surface area of Earth, of the land area, is now occupied by agriculture. And at the dawn of the Neolithic transformation, it's very hard. They didn't do censuses back then, but the estimated population was around 10 million. 10 million, just about the size of New York City in terms of population. Now we have 7.2 billion. So it's pretty hard to imagine a situation less than radical transformation in order to sustain a population of 7.2 billion, I should say. Now, part of that was essentially the creation of agriculture, of settled agriculture, of domestication. The very beginning, the origins, the genesis of genetic modification occurred when the earliest farmers collected seeds and basically planted them, and then selected from generation to generation seeds that were higher performing and met their needs. Now, this evolution took place over many thousands of years. The very earliest, perhaps, recorded in the Fertile Crescent with the earliest wheats and barley and rye. Of course, rice emerged in Asia, but most likely in China about 8,000 years ago. Maize, corn, of course, in Mesoamerica, perhaps 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. Potatoes in the Andes, and so on. So in different parts of the world, domestication took place, and over many centuries, and in some cases millennia, the farming systems evolved to a situation where today probably very little of actual hunting and gathering goes on. We have moved through subsistence, and in most parts of the world moved beyond subsistence farming to a situation of commercial farming, where producers are generating surpluses that other folks are buying. And this, of course, has coincided with urbanization. A few years ago, we passed the point where there were more people living in cities and towns than living in rural areas. Now, everybody in this classroom and probably most of those watching today are coming from an urban environment. Now, most of us, probably almost all of us, do not produce our own food. We depend on farmers. So with urbanization, farming has to evolve to be able to generate surpluses that are demanded by urban consumers. And so this has led to greater and greater sophistication of the agricultural system, use of technologies, use of mechanization, all kinds of energy and labor-saving devices, so that people could produce more than just what they needed, that they could generate surpluses. And in its, if you like, its highest form at the moment is what we might call supermarket agriculture, where supermarkets essentially, not only here in the United States, but all over the world now, are the source of food that consumers are going towards. So this is a phenomenon. Whether it's planned or not is another question, but we have seen a huge evolution of that system, to the point where many folks probably have more than they need. And if you're able to view this particular photograph, it actually comes from my home country. And this is what a typical, I wouldn't say typical, but probably not an unusual Australian family would consume in a week. You can see a lot of packaged food. You can see a lot of red meat. You can see all kinds of packaging and processed food in there. But this is, if you like, trying to illustrate the way in which we've all come, or many of us have come, from a relatively simple diet, more directly consuming food from farms and from the field, to a situation where you're part of a very complicated value chain. So this was the headline that came out, as I said, about a week ago, that world hunger had fallen to 805 million. Now, the trend is shown in this particular graph here, and again, that looking at that, you'll probably feel, hey, we're doing pretty well. At least the direction is correct. But on the other hand, if you look at the y-axis there, it starts at 300 million. So it's not kind of yet heading towards zero. But the Millennium Development Goal, which was to cut the rate of hunger or the prevalence of hunger by 50% using the 1990 to 92 baseline, there's a reasonable chance that that MDG will actually be met on an aggregate basis across the planet. So 23% going malnourished, 23.4% at the baseline, and we're at about 13.5% now, with the possibility of reaching perhaps 11.7, which would probably get us there in terms of being able to cheer and say we've achieved the Millennium Development Goal. But I think it would only be 2 cheers, because there's vast parts of the planet are not going to achieve the Millennium Development Goal on hunger, and very few will achieve, or well, by definition they cannot. But the original idea of reducing the number of people hungry, which actually came out of the Global Food Conference way before the MDGs, we're nowhere near that. We're not actually going to reduce the number from about 1 billion to 500 million. So progress, yes, but one wouldn't be ready to give ourselves an A or even a B plus for the progress made. And so we're living in a very fragile and complicated food system, where, as I said, 805 million people are still going hungry. 165 million people, children, are stunted. Okay, so we know the definition of stunting, but we also know I hope, the consequences of stunting. And although children can survive stunting, they're clearly going to be less productive, less economically active in later life. So it is a serious consequence of undernutrition in the first 1,000 days of life. 3.1 million children are dying from malnutrition each year, and most of them, almost all of them, in Asia and Africa. But on the other side of the scale, when we talk about malnutrition, it's not just undernutrition, it's also overnutrition. We have 1.4 billion adults who are overweight or obese. Okay, so with a BMI, a body mass index of 25 or above. Of those 1.4 billion adults, around 500 million are in the obese category, which is a BMI of 30 or above. So this has serious consequences. It's probably a lot worse than this, because this was the WHO estimate of 2008, and I don't think there's any reason for us to think things have improved since 2008. Most likely they've gotten worse. Now, thinking a little bit more broadly about the food system, we should also look at the astonishing amount of food that's wasted. So we talk about food shortages, but we've also got to look at food waste, and I'll come back in a little bit more detail on that later. But 30 to 50% of the food that we produce is not consumed. Okay, so this is pretty shocking. And finally, and very much relevant to the summit going on today, is that the idea that we are now pushing our planetary boundaries to their limits. So I know in earlier sessions of the Age of Sustainable Development and the Global Classroom, Professor Sachs has talked about planetary boundaries. The paper in particular by Rockstrom and his colleagues, highlights some of those boundaries that are being pushed to the limit and beyond the limit. And if you look at them, the ones that are really of major concern are those that really very directly are affected by or affect agriculture: the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, climate change, and biodiversity loss. So all of those are integrally related to agriculture and the performance and sustainability of the agricultural system. So if we don't get it right, if we don't fix the agricultural system and the food system as a whole, if we continue on the current path in terms of production methods, in terms of population growth, in terms of food waste, and so on, there are some pretty serious consequences. And we've already seen, these are not way off into the future. These are things we're all seeing now. And I'm sure, many of you out there have seen it in your own countries. Food riots, for example, that were particularly destructive in 2007, 2008, when the food prices rose very sharply in many parts of the world. Generally in urban areas, but people basically protesting that their basic needs were not being met. So when folks are on a relatively fixed income, it also coincided with the global financial crisis. So many people lost their jobs at the same time. The expenditures on food became a much greater proportion of the of their income, or even their savings in some cases. So kind of disruption caused by failures of the food system can have dire effects on investment and on the well-being of the population. Of course, the other is migration. People leave. People get up and go when they don't have food. What would you do in that situation? If you cannot provide for yourself, if your crops have failed, if you've lost your job, if you don't have the ability to feed yourself and your family, well, you get on a bus if you can afford it, or in many parts of the world, you simply walk to the nearest refugee camp, or take a big risk and get on a boat or into a container or whatever, and with all the kind of nasty consequences that we see every day in the news. Another part of it is a consequence of those high food prices and failing to deal with the food system is an expansion of agriculture into parts of the world that are fragile, that are in terms of biodiversity are threatened, in terms of in land quality and so on, should not be opened up. But there has been an expansion of land investment, agricultural investment in land, so-called land grab, which I think many people have, would have observed in Africa, but also in Asia and Latin America. This is, a matter of great concern, not only for the environment, but for the well-being of the communities that are actually living in those areas, and being dispossessed basically by often aggressive and unfair practices. And of course, as I mentioned before, the idea that the sort of hidden hunger that we talk about in the food system, the stunting effect, and the fact that if we don't get this right, especially in the first 1,000 days from conception to 2 years old, these kids are stuck with that for the rest of their life. They've got that albatross around their neck. They've got that burden of not having the cognitive skills and ability to be able to learn and to become fully, productive and in terms of the quality of their life and their immune systems and their income earning ability. Now, it's interesting as we move to this next slide to see that there's nothing really new about all this. Malthus could have been, actually could have, I suppose. The university was opened by 1798, but it wouldn't have been here. But he could have got up and basically, as a guest lecturer, talked about what is happening on this planet, and he would have just come from the UK, from England. And there were food riots in England during the 1950s and 60s. The population, there'd been a response to population growth. Various kinds of improvements had taken place, but people were starting to run out of food. Prices were going up, and folks were very unhappy. And so, he didn't call them planetary boundaries back then, but if you look at what he said, it was really the same concept of planetary boundaries. And the idea was that the power of the population and the impact of that population was superior than the ability of the Earth to provide subsistence. And he talked about gigantic, inevitable famine will wipe out vast, populations across the planet. So Malthus is already, I mean, he's always hovering in the background, I would say, reminding us of you know, the continuing challenge of having to produce enough to meet population growth. Now, in response, and this came up again in the 50s and 60s, and this was really what prompted what is known as the Green Revolution. This particular photograph is at the International Rice Research Institute, established in 1960. I spent almost 20 years at that institute. It was responsible for developing new strains of rice, new varieties of rice, and new technologies associated with rice. At the same time, in other parts of the world, particularly in Mexico, work was done on wheat, and so it was a lot of the successes of the Green Revolution in terms of development of new varieties and technologies were largely in these two commodities, rice and wheat. And what fundamentally happened was the architecture of the plants were changed so that more of the energy, more of the carbohydrate found its way into the grains rather than into the stem, the leaves, and the roots. So it was a kind of a redesign, if you like, of the plants that were sustaining the large proportion of the population. It also and also a core part of the Green Revolution approach was that by doing this, the crops were more responsive to improved conditions, which would be irrigation and improved soil fertility. And over time, incorporated issues like, or traits like resistance to pests and diseases, and even quality at one point. So this was the Asian Green Revolution, and it's often confused with simply modernization of agriculture. But I think, to be fair, when we talk about the Green Revolution, we're really talking about the improvements in the productivity, the technological improvements in the productivity of staple foods. It wasn't just about technology, however, it was also about infrastructure and policies. And we can see that the greatest successes in terms of productivity improvement, increased production, and improved levels of per capita consumption of staple foods occurred when governments got the investments and the policies right. So investments in irrigation, in extension, in credit, roads, often supported by various kinds of market subsidies and support, input subsidies, and probably the most important was national political leadership. The impact was, and this is important, this is part of the impact. The impact was that cereal production more than doubled in Asia between 1970 and 1995. The population increased by 60% over that period. So we kind of beat Malthus in a way over that period. Population increased by 60%, production doubled. Now, the crop area, the area planted to rice and wheat, only increased by 4%. So in other words, the increases were through intensification, principally intensification of existing land. So the existing land, rather than, up until that point, most of the expansion of agriculture had occurred by expanding the land frontier, by cutting down forests and moving further and further into lands in order to produce food. So this was a different approach, and it coincided with urbanization, so surpluses were produced and marketed to urban consumers. One of the net results of the Green Revolution in Asia and in Latin America to a large degree was that the price of food to consumers in real terms went down. It's often forgotten. It's often thought that the farmers were the beneficiaries of the Green Revolution. But in fact, the biggest group of beneficiaries were low-income urban consumers who had a wage and needed to get as much food as they could from that wage. So in effect, their wage rates were higher. Poverty declined, hunger declined over that period. Of course, there were criticisms of the Green Revolution, and these are discussed in the paper by Hazel, which I think was on your readings. There have been lots of discussion and reports about the environmental impact. I mentioned one of those impacts was very positive in terms of reducing the rate of deforestation and the movement of the land frontier. But on the other hand, there were in many parts of the world excessive use of fertilizers, excessive use of pesticides, increased extraction and unsustainable extraction of groundwater. So there were a lot of negative consequences on the environment side. There were some health impacts, especially early on when there was a lot of emphasis on pesticide use, although over time, as integrated pest management and pest resistance came along, that was less important. There were some early concerns about the distribution of benefits, but I think, as I said, ultimately low-income consumers got a lot out of the Green Revolution. And even though some larger farmers tended to be the early adopters, it rapidly spread to the smallest of farmers, even those who were tenant farmers. Reliance on external inputs is often thrown out as a negative. In many parts of the world, that's also viewed as a positive, being integrated to markets. But there's no question that as you move from subsistence to generating surpluses for sale, it becomes part of the business model, if you like, to procure inputs in order to generate those outputs, because we're not talking about a closed system. We're talking about when nutrients are moved outside of the farm, you have to replace those. There have been questions about the role of the private sector. There have been questions about the impact on nutrition, and I think a very good illustration of that is the fact that despite the impact on food security in South Asia, and particularly in India, malnutrition rates, stunting rates, have not increased by anything, have not improved at a level that we would expect, let's say. These are all complicated, each worthy of at least one lecture, so I'm not going to talk and elaborate on them now, but just to throw them out there as important considerations in terms of the criticisms of the Green Revolution, including the impact on Africa, which I'll come to right now. And again, you know, Africa was viewed as having been bypassed by the Green Revolution. Again, it's something that can be, you know, it takes a long time to elaborate on, but there are many factors involved, including the fact that rice and wheat, where the early sort of focus on the Green Revolution were not all that important in Africa. Africa had many other crops. They were growing cassava, they were growing maize, they were growing teff in Ethiopia, and sorghum and millets in the Sahel, taro and yams and so on in parts of West Africa. So we had a much more diverse situation. We also had mostly a rain-fed situation. 90+% of African agriculture is rain-fed. More than half of agriculture, crop agriculture in Asia, is irrigated. Makes a big difference in terms of what you can do. There was also relentless population growth, and so if we look forward now to what is going on, we have to consider several factors: population growth in Africa, increased urbanization, the most rapidly urbanizing part of the planet, the changing pattern of exports and imports. Imports are expanding. Food imports are expanding at a much greater rate than exports. So Africa is consuming a lot, especially now that economic growth rates are rapidly increasing in that part of the world. Diet habits are changing. Land is degrading. Okay, I often talk about in Africa, it's the biggest extractive industry in Africa is not mining, it's agriculture. Small-scale farmers who are not connected to markets are extracting nutrients from the soil, producing surpluses in some cases not, but essentially over time degrading soil quality, and that's an important thing. And finally, climate change, where Africa is parts of Africa at least are viewed as particularly vulnerable to climate change. And there are many reasons for that, but a couple of reasons would be the fact that they're rain-fed, so they're much more subject to fluctuations that are going to take place as a result of changing rainfall patterns, but also because of the poor infrastructure, the inability to move food from surplus areas to deficit areas. Okay, so for many reasons, it's a big worry there, but there are encouraging signs. There has been over the last few years some improvements. There have been some success stories, Ghana, Ethiopia, Malawi. You can read about them, but it is still not at the level of the continent, and certainly large quantities of food are still needed to be imported from other parts of the world. Now, Latin America is complicated for two reasons. One is I have spent less time there, and it's still very confusing to me. But I think it is a special case in that there is tremendous diversity. We've got small-scale farmers in parts of Latin America that are very similar. I've been to them in Honduras and other places, and Haiti and so on, where I've seen that they're not very different in terms of the kind of production systems and the constraints that they face than small-scale farmers in remote parts of Africa. On the other hand, we have agriculture in some parts of the continent, across South America in particular, that are very little different from what we would see in Iowa. Large-scale mechanized farming focusing on export markets. We have urbanization in general on aggregate level. South America in particular, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, very export-oriented agricultural systems. So there is no general analysis, I would say, of Latin America, but I would encourage you all to, when you look at Latin American agriculture and the food system, you have to disaggregate it and look at specific parts and specific populations. So let's move to the last part of this talk and talk a little bit about solutions, because I personally believe as we look towards 2050, probably a population of around 9 billion or a little more, perhaps flattening off at close to 10 billion by the end of the century. I think there really is a way forward, but it's not going to happen with business as usual. And my analysis leads me to see four major areas of intervention and action, technologies, policies, and institutions, focusing on improving productivity of agriculture, improving distribution and access of food, reducing food loss and waste, and shifting to healthier diets. I think we will need all of those four components. These will be, I believe, important pillars of a more sustainable agriculture and food system going forward. So, improving productivity, I think it's going to be necessary to continue to intensify, as opposed to extensify. All right, you probably won't find extensification in your dictionaries, but it is expanding your land area in order to increase production. I think we should only be increasing production in a sustainable way, largely through intensification of existing lands, and in some cases, sort of moving out of agriculture in some places of where we're over exploiting the resources and placing unreasonable pressures on the land. So we need to limit the conversion of forest, wetlands, and grasslands to agriculture. We need to be much more efficient in terms of using resources. We need to conserve and deploy the genetic resources that we have. We need to reduce the yield gap. You know, a lot of, across Africa, for example, the corn crop, the maize crop, average yields are closer to 1 ton per hectare. In Iowa, those yields are around 10 tons per hectare, also under rain-fed conditions. There's a huge yield gap, And we're not saying that all farmers need to get 10 tons per hectare, but 3, 4, 5 tons per hectare is absolutely possible with even existing technologies. Climate smart production systems, something I can come to a little bit later in question time if there's interest. We need to develop production systems that are productive in a changing climate, that enable farmers to be resilient, to be able to handle shocks to the system, both at the farm level and at the landscape level. So I want to say a couple of things about productivity. So obvious, plants need nutrients. You know, agriculture is not a closed system. Many people believe somehow we can recycle everything on a subsistence way. Now that would have been fine at a point where we weren't urbanizing, where we didn't have folks like us sitting here waiting for somebody else to produce food for us, all right? So agriculture needs to be able to supplement the nutrients or replace the nutrients that leave the farm. And what we see is a pattern across the planet where some places are overusing nutrients, are overusing fertilizers, both inorganic and organic, and this is resulting in environmental damage, essentially, and pollution of water, eutrophication of lakes and streams and coral reefs and rivers, having very negative impacts on our water system. Other parts of the world, like Africa, are underutilizing nutrients. So, as I said, a big extractive industry going on there. They come in two forms, nutrients, basically organic or inorganic. And there are many myths out there. One of the great myths, which some people have asked questions about this in a conference last week and again, fertilizers do not poison the soil. There are many myths in agriculture. This is one of the greatest of them all. Increasing fertilizer use can actually increase organic matter. And if you have time, take a look at this graph here. You'll see that if you inject fertilizer into a degraded system, you can actually capture more of the carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and increase your carbon levels and your organic matter levels in soils. A question is often raised, can organic agriculture feed the world? Some folks believe it can, but the research, the evidence out there does not support that. Organic yields are typically lower than conventional yields, and where the systems are comparable, around a sort of 34% less than organic systems. But these systems are very contextual. In different parts of the world, in different types of systems, in different situations, you can see comparable yields between organic and inorganic. But of course, yields aren't everything, by the way. Yields are part of the issue. But in terms of sheer productivity, generating enough food for people to consume, it's very difficult. It's impossible to envisage organic agriculture meeting those needs. Organic agriculture will have a niche, will have a place, and actually many of the principles of organic agriculture are important and could improve more, commercial, some folks call industrial systems of agriculture. I believe most likely some kind of hybrid model that incorporates both inorganic and organic sources of nutrients is most likely to be effective in most situations. Let me move to GMOs, because a few people have been asking me questions about this, and I figure I can't get away with silence. Many folks in many situations prefer not to talk about it. But let me talk about it a little bit. Is that guy supporting GMO? I'm sure he is. So, cassava, this woman is in Tanzania, and she grows cassava. She produces enough for her family, a little bit to sell and get some income. That cassava has been essentially wiped out by a virus called African mosaic virus, okay? Yellow mosaic virus. that cassava will yield nothing when it gets that virus. It's kind of the, you know, it prevents all production. So what to do? Give up growing cassava, maybe. There is very little resistance to this within various varieties of cassava. So one alternative is through genetic engineering to be able to inject that resistance into the varieties that those farmers are growing. So what if we were able to do that and restore the livelihood and the food supply of those of that woman and the basically hundreds of millions across Africa who depend on cassava? It's the third most important food crop. What if in southern Africa, if farmers are facing drought, we could, through genetic engineering, through modern molecular methods, be able to develop varieties that were tolerant of drought? Is that something we should be afraid of? And if we would ask this woman, what do you think? Is it a good idea or is it too risky? I think I have the answer. What if, and this is the famous golden rice example, we had rice that had high beta-carotene, which would reduce the incidence of blindness and death, which affects about 1 million children every year. You know, what if it was possible that the existing varieties that farmers grow could be tweaked in such a way that relatively modest amounts of rice, even though they're a different color now, they're yellow instead of white, so that's going to take a bit of adaptation, of course, change in eating habits. But if that could effectively end blindness, is it such a bad idea? Are you prepared to get out there and fight against it? What if we had a rice variety that had a fundamentally different system of photosynthesis? Right now, those of you who have a background in biology or botany know the difference between a C3 pathway and a C4 pathway. C4 pathways are more efficient. They're more efficient in terms of their use of sunlight, water, and nutrients. There's work going on right now to develop a C4 rice, because rice is a C3 plant. And the idea is that that plant can actually reduce water consumption, reduce the amount of nutrients required, be better suited in a high carbon dioxide environment, and essentially produce more from less. So, I will make no conclusion. I leave it to all of you out there to send me a barrage of emails. But all I would really ask as development practitioners is that you think twice before rejecting GMOs. Think more deeply, think more analytically about it. Think, what are the risks? Yes, absolutely. What are the risks? The risks of action and the risks of inaction. Also think about it from the perspective of those who are growing the food, not from the safety of Columbia University or somewhere else in Europe or other places where, you know, we have a certain level of comfort where we can choose what we eat and look at the opportunities, but also look at the ethics of all this. You know, the idea that that the poor producers, we're basically saying, should not benefit from progress in biology, in genetic engineering. Is it ethically correct that the beneficiaries of GMOs up until now are principally large-scale farmers in Iowa and other parts of the United States and Latin America? You know, is that actually fair? And the reason why it's difficult, it's rather difficult to do the sorts of things that we've talked about here in terms of improving staple foods, is that you need a lot of money for this. And it tends to be that the big companies out there, the Monsantos and others of the world, I mean, because of the various restrictions, they need to spend an enormous amount of money. So therefore, they're going to focus on large-scale farmers with lots of money who are demanding these varieties. Okay, so I think think of the ethics of the technologies needed for sustainable agriculture. I just want you all to reflect on that. Just very quickly, the second area of distribution and access is important. It's not just about production, okay? I know that. It's not, I have spent a lot of my time on production, but it's also about distribution. You know, you can produce as much as you like, but ultimately it needs to reach consumers. And we're talking about equitable development, sustainable and equitable development. Social safety nets, good market infrastructure. As I was saying for Africa, one of the challenges of Africa is not that we can't increase production, we can't distribute the surpluses to the deficit areas. And people in those areas often do not have the incomes to be able to purchase the food. So trade policies, infrastructure, critically important. Food waste. 1/3 of the food produced is lost or wasted, $1 trillion a year in value, all along the food chain, from production to consumption. In low-income countries, it's mainly about the sort of the front end, the production and the transport part of it. The food losses there. Not a lot of food waste. At the other end, places like New York City, you see it every day here. The amount of food that's wasted, and it's mostly at the consumer and the retail level. So there are lots of interventions that are needed there. Some of them are technical, some of them are policies to reduce food waste, many of them are actually behavioral. How, you know, we need to change the way we treat, you know, ordering a huge quantity of sandwiches for a group and then throwing half of them away, you know, because you're not just throwing away the food, and I see that I'm running out of time. You're not just throwing away the food, you're throwing away all the nutrients and water and energy that went into that food. Lastly, shifting to healthier diets. At the end of the day, we can produce, okay, we can distribute, we can reduce losses, but it's really driven by demand. So it's important that the driving force of our system is healthy, sustainable diets. And there are many consequences of that, including particularly in our part of the world here, to reduce consumption of some of these products that are both bad for your health and also bad for the environment. So these are the 4 areas. In terms of solutions, I want to emphasize very strongly, all of them are important in their own context. The solutions, these are generic, of course, but the solutions will be different in the United States, in Africa, in Asia, okay, in Europe. There will be different tailored solutions for those situations. Okay, so let me stop there, and I'm sure we have some questions, and I'll do what I can to answer them. Okay, yeah, just to make the point but I can elaborate if needed, but I did look at those questions that were raised before the lecture. I've tried to incorporate it. If you don't think I have, please like give more scores to some of these questions that we should raise. So shall I put select here?
Screen share first.
Okay. Now? Good, I'm back. I haven't passed out from speaking for 50 minutes. So I should be careful what to select. I should read whether I can answer the question or not, right? That's the idea. Okay, so the question of subsidies. You know, I think, first of all, when we talk about subsidies, we've also got to look at who are actually benefiting and who are losing from subsidies. Now, while there's a kind of a gut feeling that we need to remove all the subsidies on agriculture, particularly in the north, in Europe, the United States, and so on, one of the consequences of subsidies is lower cost food. In places where the dominant members of the population are actually non-producing consumers, they actually might be quite happy with subsidies, and one has to be, a little cautious going forward that if all of the North was to eliminate all of its subsidies, what consequence, would that have on world food prices? I think that's one factor. But at the same time, I think we live in a world that's real. This is what the situation is. I think there are increasingly, as nations, sort of appreciate that subsidies are costly. I think you see increasing pressure even on the wealthier countries to reduce their subsidies on agriculture. It's not happening at the rate that those in other parts of the world would like to see, but it's nevertheless happening. And again, once we remove those subsidies, we also need to look at who's going to benefit from those. Are they small-scale farmers in Africa? Are they going to be in a position to really respond? Or is it larger-scale farmers in other parts of the world who can take advantage, of new market opportunities? So I think it's very complicated. I mean, the whole subsidy story is an interesting one. I've been on one side of that for a long time, and that is, my basic argument is small-scale agriculture in many parts of the world actually should be subsidized. I've been promoting a subsidy program in Malawi for almost 10 years now. And the argument is really, why not? There have been many criticisms of that, saying, well, it's not sustainable. Okay? Well, neither is poverty and hunger. And neither is the kind of rioting and insurrection and social disruption that occurs when the food system fails. So, I believe, at least for a fairly significant period, we need to help small-scale farmers improve their productivity and achieve a transition to more productive agriculture by subsidizing. I do encourage you to look at the experience of Malawi and a few other parts of the world, but you'll also see very strong criticisms of that approach coming from countries that subsidize their own farmers. Okay, so that kind of bugged us a little bit, and that's what got us very excited about supporting subsidy programs. Well, I'm not sure what this really means, but let me try. Okay, so I don't know if there is a global strategy. I think there's unprecedented global awareness of the need for improving food security. There's a lot of talk out there. The Secretary General of the UN has a zero hunger initiative, which everybody, of course, buys into. We have the Food and Agriculture Organization. We have all kinds of sort of institutions out there that are geared towards policies and hopefully investments that will improve food security on a global scale. Ultimately, it has to be decided at the national level. A few years ago, Professor Sachs and myself worked on developing a global fund in the same way that the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria was established to support progress in the health sector at the national level. We tried to push this same idea for agriculture, for smallholder agriculture. It had the unfortunate acronym of GASP, GASFP. If you look it up, it's a very interesting program, but it's basically stopped. You know, we raised $1 billion, we reached 25 countries. The whole idea was we would support countries with their strategies, because we heard from finance ministers, yeah, it started off in Africa. So we said, yeah, we want an African green revolution. Great idea. So where are we going to get the funds from? Take it out of the education sector or the health sector or stop building roads? We need additional resources. So we argued for this global fund. You know, it hasn't had the traction that we had hoped. And, you know, so looking forward, it's one of the things that we're looking at right now. There's going to be a big conference on financing for development, for the Sustainable Development Goals going forward next year in Addis Ababa. And we hope that, you know, part of that proposal, which we're working on in terms of supporting the UN system, to, you know, agree to the, you know, the idea of a global funding mechanism that wouldn't prescribe policies to be applied in different countries, but those countries would be in a position to fund their own strategies, integrated food, you know, the kinds of things I just talked about, the production, the distribution, reducing food waste, and helping shift people towards more sustainable and healthy diets. Let's keep moving on this. We've done that. Right. GMOs have appeared.
Yeah, the next two are about GMOs.
Okay.
You can scroll down.
All right, let me just look at both of them then. Yeah, well, I don't know whether this started before I kind of rushed through my little GMO story. You know, I think the first thing the first thing I want to say, as, you know, a professor and somebody who's been a practitioner in agriculture for over 30 years, is that, you know, I'm kind of neutral about GMOs versus any other technologies. I don't care positively or negatively about multinational companies. I think there are roles for you know, within the whole agriculture food security ecosystem, there are roles for all of these, okay? My main interest is a food system that isn't as badly broken as I showed you in one of my earlier slides, where we've got 805 million people hungry, 1.4 billion people obese, 165 million children stunted. You know, it's really not acceptable. And it's in an environment where the world, where, you know, we're going to be subject to climate change. So, you know, my view is we've got to be really smart about this. We've got to be, you know, the reality is we can't go back to the 1950s. We can't go back to the 1850s. We're here now with 7.2 billion people, you know, ratcheting up to 9 billion pretty soon. So we've got to find a way that people have access to safe, affordable food, good quality food. So I think all options should be open here, and the kind of scientific breakthroughs that we've had, you know, with the human genome, and now applied more widely to plants and even animals. We need to explore the potential for that to solve some of our big problems. Of course, we have to examine the risks, but we have to examine the risks of everything we do, including the risks of inaction. You know, the arguments are there on environment, but again, I urge you all to take a hard look at the case. Look at the varieties, for example, the types of crops that have been introduced in terms of BT cotton, for example, reducing the number of pesticide applications. Read about it. Read about the impact of that. Okay? Read about the science of it. Don't just read anecdotal newspaper reports. Dig deeper into this stuff. Look at herbicide resistant varieties which have been introduced. Don't just look at, oh, herbicides have increased as a result of this, which is true actually. But a less toxic herbicide which is broken down more quickly than traditional herbicides that are used. And along with that has been the fact that farmers have reduced their cultivation, which has actually, reduced soil runoff and erosion. So there's a deeper story to all this. Without, I'm not wanting to be defensive. The farmers are making their own decisions, right? But what I'd like to see, and I think that's the essence of these questions. Now, how is this affecting small-scale farmers? Is it good or bad for them? Well, the problem is, at the moment, it's not even affecting them, except, well, BT cotton, large numbers of farmers are adopting that, small-scale farmers in India and China. But, there's only, I think, 2 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have allowed GMOs to be grown in their country, commercialized. And it's all largely because of confusion and a lot of pressure from European donors to influence governments to be extremely cautious about this. Again, I would say, the poor are paying for the anxieties of the rich. And this is David Zilberman, our colleague at Berkeley, has said this. The poor are paying for this. Is it ethically right that they basically say, right, you guys in Europe must be correct, so we won't go down that route. We prefer to be hungry and stunted. Makes no sense to me. So I think we have to just look harder at this. We're not going to solve this one today, and that's what I ask everybody here and everybody there to dig deeper, to go beyond, the Vandana Shiva headlines. Read behind that. What's the basis for this? Suicide in India. Wonderful case of misinformation. There has been absolutely no increase in farmer suicides since the introduction of GM cotton. But you'll find lots of websites that are saying that, and lots of anecdotes. And of course, you'll find some farmers who grew GM cotton and took their lives, unfortunately. But there's been no increase as a result of GMOs. So we need to be very logical and careful about. There are hundreds of thousands of farmers who've benefited from the fact that they don't use as much pesticide. The yields have gone up and they've used less pesticide, and they're less likely to be poisoned by insecticide use on cotton. So think about that. Okay, so are there any, we still got a few minutes. Have you, what would be the next one? Let's get out of GMOs for a bit. Well, I'm happy to come back anytime. Well, this is a good question, but it's out of my field. But somebody here has mentioned fish, and in a recent conference, I heard that I think it's 3 billion people on the planet depend on fish for at least a significant part of their protein. It's a pretty shocking story for a number of reasons. One is we've clearly overfished our natural environment, and there are a lot of problems associated with fish farming, with agriculture. I think it's definitely been a neglected aspect of agricultural research and development. The whole international ag research system has about 15 centers now. I mentioned the rice center. There's one on maize. There's one on semi-arid crops. There's 15 centers. One of them work on fish. The other 14 pretty much work on crops. Not quite, but most of them work on crops. One works on animals. So there has been a bit of a kind of a bias and focus towards that. I think that can be turned around. The experts tell us that just like in crops, there's a lot that can be done, both in terms of in technologies and policies and institutions that can make natural populations of fish more sustainable. But many of them have to recover, will need years to recover, and there are ways of improving productivity and sustainability regular aquaculture fisheries. I think it really is a big deal. One thing to think about, though, and I haven't quite reconciled this in my own mind, is that, and here I particularly sort of direct ourselves to the West, and where we tend to be over-consuming red meat, we're often encouraged to shift to fish. Okay, for our health, for dietary purposes, move towards fish consumption. So you can actually see this in the marketplace. In the last 10 years, the cost, the price of fish has really increased, tremendously increased. Now, that may turn out to be good for our health, but it's probably not very good for the fish resources. And so there's here's a case of a bit of a conflict between a health objective and a sustainability objective. So something to think about. I don't really quite have the personal answer to that, except that we clearly do need to spend more effort on fisheries and other livestock-related systems, and preferably those systems, not necessarily dealing with the promotion, and certainly not with the subsidization of beef and sort of cattle, which really are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. So, Green Revolution. Okay, we might have one or two more. The Green Revolution. Okay, now this is a good question. This is the Green Revolution and essentially the public policy aspects of it. I'll go to that one now. So the issue of the Green Revolution, the fact that the Green Revolution in Asia was very much affected by public intervention, public policies, public investment, roads, often subsidies, support prices, and so on. What's the role of the private sector in all this, and going forward, what will be the role of the private sector? One of the reasons why the Green Revolution, in fact, took on much faster in Asia than it did in Africa was that there was already a private sector. Okay, the private sector existed there, and the systems and the infrastructure were better suited to dealing with surpluses. In Africa, that wasn't the case, and it wasn't the case almost for many reasons. Ironically, it was because there wasn't enough public investment. So, the infrastructure was in such a bad state, and because of structural adjustment, the policies of structural adjustment led to the dismantling of a lot of public institutions in Africa that were absolutely essential for the Green Revolution in Asia. But things are starting to change, and that's why I said there were some promising signs in terms of Africa. There's a lot more investment in private sector investment in agriculture in Africa. There is more public sector investment now starting to take place. So the two are actually related. I think the challenge going forward is ensuring not only that aspect of productivity improvement, but is it equitable, and to what extent can we engage small scale farmers? I've had investors come to me and say, I'd really like to buy up some land in Africa. Where should I go? I discourage them. I say, don't buy land. Build a factory. Supply inputs. Do something that will support small-scale farming. Help organize small-scale farmers around cooperatives, around producer groups. Give them the opportunities. Work with governments so roads are put in. Electrification. As these take place, I think it's a much better investment. Help link those small-scale farmers to international markets and regional markets. That is a much better investment of the private sector than land investment and sort of trying to transplant large-scale, industrial models, superimposing them in situations where, you know, in my view, in many cases, those regions, those parts of the world are not ready for that. They don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the kind of social structures to be able to deal with that effectively. So I think going towards small-scale, farmer-driven agricultural development, mediated by government, but with lots of support, incentives, encouragement to the private sector would be the way to go. So I think it's 9:15 here in New York, and I think we have to close at this time. Yeah, I think it's a really tough topic to cover. I think as development practitioners, all of you, I mean, one thing that's important always is to you know, consider practical solutions. There are ideas and ideologies out there, but we should always come back to thinking about why are we doing this, who are the winners, who are the losers. I think we should be constantly reminded of the core principles of sustainable development, that we look for, we want to see economic growth, particularly in low and middle income areas. You know, we want to see social inclusion. We want to make sure that those who've been bypassed by various efforts to improve technology, whether it's the green revolution or whether it's GMOs or whatever, whether it's infrastructure improvements, they need to be included, and we need to be conscious of environmental sustainability. Okay, so and that's particularly important today when everybody's, you know, meeting downtown here to talk about climate change. So with that, I will close and certainly look forward to any future questions, and we'll try to perhaps answer some of the ones we didn't get to today. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. So we'll break for